Hi, this is Pat Moorhead with More Insights and Strategy, and we're here for another More Insights and Strategy podcast. And you know that I love innovation, and we are here to talk about some serious innovation, specifically U.S. innovation policy and how it can incentivize critical R&D. I'm here with two incredible experts. Laurie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Jonathan, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Hey, the great part is we have the entire United States covered. We have West Coast, we have Middle Coast in Texas, and East Coast in DC. I feel like everybody is represented. But no, as you may have caught on our podcast before, we're all about tech, we're all about analysis, and this is going to be a great conversation. I think we've been planning this for 3 or 4 months, but here we are. So maybe we'll start with Jonathan. So let's talk about the importance of R&D, research and development. Jonathan, you've done a ton of research on how investments in innovation historically corresponds with innovation in policy at the federal level. So my question for you, believe it or not, there is a question, is what are some of the key levers that policymakers can pull to incentivize investment in high-risk R&D?
All right. Thanks for the question. The metaphor I like to use is to think about the innovation economy as an ecosystem. And we've got different parts. It's a holistic idea. And the government can play a role in each of these parts. At the basic research level, government funding plays an important role. These are general purpose technologies that spread across the whole economy. The gains are so big, they're too big for one company to internalize themselves. And so the federal government has an important role to play. But it's just as important in how do we take that basic research and we translate it into products and services that consumers can use and that ripple across the economy. I've studied the US innovation economy back to the late 19th century. Over and over, you see that the secret is private entrepreneurial innovation that takes that basic research and translates it into products and services. That's where the patent system comes in. You just have to have a strong patent system to elicit investment and to get the risk capital into the system to make that magic happen.
Jonathan, what do you mean by pattern system?
Sure. There's two great entrepreneurial periods in U.S. innovation. One happened in the early 20th century, and one happened in the 1980s and 1990s, and we're still seeing the effects of those today. What's really interesting is that in both of those periods, which were inventor-driven, small firm-driven invention, the patent system was robust. You could go into court and you had a high level of confidence the court is going to respect your patent. You didn't have a lot of antitrust limitations on licensing, which allowed the technology to get out into the market. This benefited not just the inventor, it invented all the businesses that grow out of that invention and ultimately all the way down to the consumer. And that's the secret of the U.S. innovation economy. It's the combination of property rights and risk capital. That's what gets innovation into consumers' hands.
Now, I love patents, and it is amazing. It's funny, my brother's a patent attorney, and my father was a GC that did a lot in patents. So I got patents at an early age, and I was the disappointment kid who didn't go into law. So, but here we are. I'm talking patents. This is wonderful, and it's amazing that how little people actually understand about patents. Primarily, is you are explaining to the world in infinite detail, in some points, your secrets that you have. So it really is a two-way street, protection versus sharing it with the rest of the world. Laurie, I want to swing to you. So obviously, Qualcomm, world of semiconductors. Semiconductors are now cool. 10 years ago, people weren't too sure, but everybody thinks they are today. But there's a lot of discussion about onshoring and the need to increase domestic manufacturing, saw this with the CHIPS Act and supply chain resiliency. But some people have pointed out, such as myself, that keeping R&D leadership is of equal, if not greater, importance. But so why is that the case? What's the argument there?
Yeah, and let me begin with Jonathan's term of ecosystem, because when we talk about the semiconductor industry, we are also talking about an ecosystem, and obviously, manufacturing fabrication is one part of that ecosystem. But to your point, the semiconductor design position that Qualcomm occupies is really a critical part of growing and creating that ecosystem, including the manufacturing dimension. So if you look at the kind of value chain around semiconductors, the most significant part of that ecosystem, both from an economic point of view, as well as from a national security technology leadership point of view, is that design position, and that's really driven by R&D. So Qualcomm occupies two critical positions in the broader mobile 5G semiconductor ecosystem. First is the foundational technology, the R&D that drives each generation of cellular technology. We're midway in the 5G era, thinking about 6G. And then also in that semiconductor design position. So if you think about it as a continuum, that really is, to Jonathan's point, about growing an ecosystem that in 5G encompasses auto, IoT, distance learning, as we experienced during COVID, telehealth, really every vertical in our economy and a society leveraging mobile technology. The R&D, foundational R&D drives what we call the 5G standard. That standard, which is sort of a technological blueprint for the world. The semiconductor design position is a way to leverage, accelerate deployment of that foundational technology. Semiconductors become critical to driving that technology in the context of, again, all of these different verticals we've talked about. So the R&D position really is the linchpin for everything that leverages that technology through the ecosystem that Jonathan described. And of course, the strength of our patent system is what determines our ability to maintain those very large, long horizon, high risk R&D investments.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I like to break apart the R and the D because they are very much different things. The R is speculative, high risk research that doesn't always have a happy ending. There's a lot of risk that goes into it. And typically the development side is taking intellectual property and the research that sticks and productizing it. And, I've said this on CNBC, talking about Qualcomm and a few other companies. Qualcomm is one of the last and only companies out there doing the R and putting the high risk research dollars into that. There's a few others here in the United States, but I think we've lost track a little bit of the value of what that brings, because it is the tip of the spear. Everything happens after research. Manufacturing is important, design and development is important, and then productizing it and then product is super important, but it all starts with the R. I think let's talk about IP policy and how it relates to this. And maybe we can talk about how strong intellectual property protections incentivize R&D. I mean, I kind of think it is common sense, kind of like, hey, if you don't get money back on your investment, why in the world would you do it? But maybe talk about what happens if those protections are weakened, like we've seen maybe with different administrations, and try and use discrete examples talking about this. I think the audience would appreciate that.
To answer your question, I think we have to understand a little bit more deeply the role of patents in the wireless industry. And building on what Laurie said, when we say wireless industry, we really should say connectivity industry. This industry is so huge that it's impossible to understate its significance. We're not talking about phones anymore, and we're not even just talking about cars. This is just going to ripple through everyday experience. And what we need to appreciate is that the patent not only supports the incentives to invest in R&D, but it supports an entire licensing and standard setting structure that has been set up entirely by private industry, globally, principally among a handful of US and European companies. This is what makes the Samsung phone is able to talk to the Apple phone and so forth. This is a mission critical part of our infrastructure, and the patent system enables this by not only allowing the innovator to capture a return on their investment, but allowing innovators to share information amongst each other safely. It allows them to structure that information flow. So what happens when we start to weaken the patent system? And I think it's important to appreciate what's happened in this country since roughly the mid-2000s is that almost without exception, every decision by the Supreme Court, with an exception under the leadership of Macon Delrahim and the past administration at the antitrust agencies, virtually every action by the antitrust agencies and legislation in Congress, every one of these things have diluted patent protection. So what are you doing when you're doing that? You're reducing the reward to innovation. You're also starting to reduce the incentives to share information, which is the basis for standard setting and licensing out that technology. Again, when you license out the technology, what that does is it allows any device maker to come right into the market, and they don't have to reinvent the wheel. The technology is there for them. That's why you see smartphones, all of these patent-dependent devices, the price is declining adjusted for quality at orders of magnitude that we haven't seen previously in technology history. So what we've been doing as we've been diluting the patent system is that we have been undercutting this phenomenally successful case of private ordering. The other error that we have made is that the crown jewel assets of the design segment in the semiconductor industry are generated by a handful of US and European companies, roughly 3. Mm-hmm. And so what we are doing is that we are diluting, we are devaluing our own comparatively advantageous position in the supply chain ecosystem. This doesn't make any economic sense.
What do you think, Laurie? I'm sure you've got some opinions on this.
I do. And let me just, again, build off of Jonathan's comments, which I could not agree with more. I think the other point that's important to understand as we look at the importance of IP policy, strong intellectual property rights, is that, you know, in the current day, in the 21st century, the vast majority of R&D that funds these critically important technologies, whether it's cellular, you know, or everything that kind of works in combination with cellular to create our 5G ecosystem, those R&D efforts are largely funded, almost exclusively funded in the United States by private companies, by the commercial sector. So, you know, we often talk about, you know, the space race of the 1950s or what have you, the work that important government organizations do, like DARPA. But the reality today is that in order for us to lead in these important technology sectors, we have to incentivize the private sector to make these, again, very large horizon investments in R&D. And just to, you know, by way of further context, when we talk about each standard in cellular technology, there's about 10 years of pre-standard, pre-competitive, pre-commercial R&D that drives that ultimate standard, that ultimate leadership position. So the private sector is funding these R&D efforts. That's a good thing. But there has to be market legal incentives that encourage those investments. And historically, as a nation, we've looked to our patent system to drive, again, big bets in R&D in our innovation economy. And the impact and benefits of that system should be, Pat, to your point, self-evident. The fact that the United States has led the world in innovation throughout our history is a testament to how important that patent system has been to our entrepreneurial R&D based economy. But I think we often lose sight of the fact that, without those incentives, which again are largely driven by our patent system, that R&D calculus breaks down. You no longer have the ability to justify those big investments in R&D. So it's critically important to your question that we maintain policies that promote strong intellectual property, and really understand that in order for the United States, for other market-based, rule of law-based economies to have a coherent, effective innovation policy, intellectual property has to be at the center of those policies. And so, to your earlier point, yes, it's great that semiconductors are cool, but if we lose sight of that R&D foundation and the role of patents in maintaining that R&D focus, then all of these conversations around manufacturing, supply chain diversification, really become the sort of tail wagging the dog. We've lost sight of what's critically important in terms of our ability to sustain technology leadership in important places.
Yeah, I don't think it's a surprise or an aberration, the direct correlation between a strong patent system and growth. And while I'm not as versed in the subject as the two of you are, I have run multiple billion-dollar businesses for large companies, and there's a pretty causal effect that I see. And what happens when those patent protections go down is you focus more on market taking rather than market making and increasing the TAM. You have basic technologies that just don't work with each other, whether it's network, data transport, things like that. And also the barriers to entry. I mean, bigger companies get bigger, and the smaller companies have a hard time getting in and getting a piece of the action. And less competition is less innovation and higher costs. So we talked a little bit about some of the concerns that you have about, for lack of a better term, misguided patent policy in this space. But can you talk about how policymaking in the wrong direction adversely impacts investment and innovation? I know we touched on this, but I want to go a little bit deeper. And maybe we'll start with you, Laurie.
Sure. So just to build on Jonathan's earlier comments, over the last, when I started my career in as a lawyer, as an intellectual property lawyer, we were sort of at the height of intellectual property protection in this country. There was a very strong recognition that in order for us to lead, not only did we need to maintain strong intellectual property rights at home, but we needed to ensure that our trading partners also adhere to strong intellectual property rights. And so, again, think about IP as both those market-based incentives that drive R&D investments, plus the U.S. intellectual property system has also served as an important signaling effect, if you will, stabilizing effect in ensuring that the global market it respects intellectual property. What's happened in my career, again, as Jonathan mentioned, over the past 15 years or so, has been a real kind of course change in how we view the intellectual property system. There's been a steady erosion of intellectual property rights through our courts, through our legislature, through regulatory changes. And those in combination have, I think, made it much more difficult for R&D intensive companies to succeed and sustain all of the challenges of competing in a global market. One of the indicators of that is, the extent to which private capital, venture capital dollars are actually flowing to R&D intensive startups. That's a really important barometer in terms of, are we maintaining legal market-based incentives that support an entrepreneurial economy in, again, R&D intensive sectors. And so we've seen a move of those private, venture capital, private capital dollars away from patent intensive, R&D intensive sectors towards more of the, social media type innovators. And, again, that's not to be to diminish the importance of those companies, but if you look at the spaces that we care about, deeply care about as a nation, not just from an economic point of view, but from a national security, technology leadership point of view, those are highly R&D intensive spaces. When you talk about leading in AI, leading in cellular, leading in quantum, leading in biotech, those are the spaces that necessitate those, big R&D dollars, and that's where the patent system plays a critically important role. And then, of course, the other dimension of this is talent. When we talk about R&D investments, as a company, we're talking about maintaining the world's best workforce of highly specialized, highly educated engineers. And again, as you erode the strength of the patent system and diminish incentives to invest in these R&D intensive spaces, that talent pool goes elsewhere. So there's a kind of pipeline effect beyond just kind of sheer dollars. Are you incentivizing a workforce to specialize in these areas of technology that we care about? So again, this is a multidimensional dynamic, but maintaining those intellectual property incentives, again, in a market-based, rule of law-based economy is critically important, because there is no plan B. We can't rely on massive government subsidization to replace those R&D dollars, nor do we want to. We want the private sector to thrive, and we want the market to function as it should in spurring these R&D investments and entrepreneurial activities.
Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll return back to my ecosystem metaphor, but I'm going to deploy it a little bit differently. A healthy innovation ecosystem is technologically diverse. It's business model diverse. Okay. If you look at the companies that have been lobbying successfully for the reductions in the force of patent protections since, again, roughly the mid-2000s, you will see over and over again, it is the same handful of very successful companies, very meritorious companies, but they rely on a platform-based business model. It's an integrated product services ecosystem. Patent protection is not critical for their business model, and in some cases, it's just an input cost that they would like to minimize and preferably eliminate. Right. What this ties into the data that Laurie is referring to. We see risk capital wants to invest in innovation. That's where the premia are, right? But they are moving away from the patent-dependent business models because those business models' viability is threatened as the patent protection system weakens. So what you see is actually not an aggregate reduction in the dollars flowing to innovation. Okay, but you see something that is just as costly, both economically and from a national security perspective. You see a distortion in where those dollars are going. Those dollars are flowing to platform tech, which again is an important part of the ecosystem, but it can't be the whole ecosystem. The ecosystem over time will suffer because the parts of the ecosystem in wireless, and again, I go back to my original point, we're not just talking about phones, we're talking about everything today. The critical innovation in wireless has relied on a licensing-based business model. This is not because the inventor wants to tax industry, as is often alleged. It's because it's a way for the innovator to monetize their inventions. It delivers a return on R&D, but actually, more importantly, it allows every single device maker who wants to use that R&D to use it. And at the end of the day, we actually don't see this traditional trade-off that's drawn between patents and competition. They actually work perfectly together in wireless. We can deliver returns to the innovator through the patent, through exclusivity. And at the same time, that is actually our best mechanism to make the production segments of the digital economy as competitive as possible, keep those entry barriers as low as possible. And at the end of the day, it's the consumer who's the winner. Thank you.
Yeah, very additive points here, Laurie. I love the reaffirmation of global importance of patent protections. I find it seriously ironic that the US was the bastion of patent protections and now we're not. I mean, pretty much everybody built their system around us. And I know in the 1800s, the UK had a certain system. But I would say the past 50 years, people were looking to us. And to your point on VC investment, it is hard to get tier one VCs to invest a lot into semiconductors for the very reasons that you're talking about. And giveaways are a great way to jumpstart something, but they're not a means to an end. And when giveaways, you are going to have inefficiencies because again, not just picking on our governments, but those dollars aren't typically spent wisely. And whether it's a 6-to-1 ratio or a 10-to-1 ratio on what happens, I am very enthused in what has happened in chip manufacturing in areas like Austin and New York, where it is actually a payoff back to the ecosystem. But we can't, we can't forget about the R and the D as very vital parts. And Jonathan, you bringing in the platform tech companies, the irony is those same platform companies live and breathe based on the R&D of semiconductors and the wheel of increased efficiency and performance to run their business models. So literally they're cutting off their nose to spite their face. And it's just like, it doesn't have a good ending if that happening. And by the way, if there's a free open system of chip IP, let us have it. It's not the same as software, open source software. And anyways, I think I'll leave it at that. I really appreciate the insights, Laurie and Jonathan, that you brought to the table here. And I hope each one of you is successful in communicating the importance of U.S. innovation on critical R&D. It's one thing to get the CHIPS Act through, great. It's manufacturing, Science Act. Maybe the right people will receive that money, but in the end, that's not the long-term solution. The long-term solution, part of it is protecting intellectual property. I mean, I'm sorry, Laurie and Jonathan, you do this for a living. I don't, but it's very simple to me as an entrepreneur. You give me a reason to do something economically, and I'm going to do it. You remove the economic benefit, and I'm not going to do it. It's not very hard here. So anyways, thanks for moving this conversation along. This is Pat Moorhead with More Insights and Strategy. Big thanks to Laurie and Jonathan. We're talking U.S. innovation policy on incentivizing critical R&D. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe button. If you want to have comments, good, bad, or ugly, you know where to find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I spend way too much time on both of those platforms. Have a good morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are on the planet. Thanks.